Hello, everyone. This is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with the Cutoff vs. Button vs. Blind Play Part 2, and we're mostly going to be finishing up pre-flop play in this video. Before we begin, I do want to point out that we are really going to jump in right where we left off from the first video, so watch the first video in this series before you watch this one. All right, so let's jump in. So where we left off in the last video, we were discussing how after we 3-bet the cutoff open from the big blind, the pot would be 19 big blinds total, because we were 3-betting to 9.25 big blinds when out of position. So our post-flop expected value needed to be 9.25 big blinds, because that's how big our 3-bet was, minus 1.437 big blinds equals 7.81 big blinds. So this was what our expected value needed to be post-flop after 3-betting with the worst hand in our 3-betting range in the big blind in order for our 3-bet to either break even or be profitable. So we'd need our expected value to be at least 7.81 big blinds on average with hands like King 2 suited and 6-4 suited post-flop, since these are our weakest 3-bets, for these ranges to be correct. Now, don't let this get confusing, because I understand we took a break at kind of an awkward time after the first video, and it's kind of hard to get hit with all these numbers at once, especially when you can express this math in different ways. But just make sure you understand that based off how often we thought the cutoff was 4-betting, calling, and folding against our big blind 3-bet, we knew that when we did 3-bet from the big blind and got called, we'd need our expected value to be 7.81 big blinds or greater post-flop in order for these 3-bets to be correct. So if we don't think we can win on average 7.81 big blinds or more post-flop after we 3-bet pre-flop with a hand like King 2 suited or 6-4 suited, then we made a mistake pre-flop because we were 3-betting too weak hands. So now it's probably useful to just see, well, what percentage is 7.81 big blinds of the entire pot? And that's 41.1%. And so now we need to ask ourselves, does this seem reasonable? Do we think on average, let's take King 2 suited for example, do we think on average if the cutoff opens and we 3-bet King 2 suited, we'll be able to win 7.81 big blinds or more post-flop? Will we, in other words, be able to capture like 41.1% of all the money that's in the pot or more on average? So it's probably a good idea for you to take a moment and actually think about this before I give you my opinion. So just really ask yourself, do you think you're going to be able to capture 41.1% of the monies that's in the pot with hands like King 2 suited or 6-4 suited? Or if you don't, ask yourself what types of hands you think you'd need. Then when you do, let's go on to the next slide. So yeah, pause and think if you need to. And I'm going to discuss my thoughts. So in my opinion, I think our EV will be less than 7.81 big blinds, but honestly, it's very hard to tell. The reason why I think our EV will be less than 7.81 big blinds with those weak hands is we're out of position against a reasonably strong range. A GTO player would likely defend quite aggressively against our continuation bets. And King 2 suited or 6-4 suited just don't make strong hands very often. Yeah, King 2 suited will make, a pair of kings with no kicker sometimes, and that's a pretty good hand. And 6-4 suited will usually give us some, or not usually, but sometimes give us some pretty good like semi-bluffing hands, or even sometimes flop like a flush or straight draw, but it doesn't usually give us an awesome hand very often. So if I had to guess, I would guess our expected value post-flop is lower than 7.81 big blinds with hands that are this weak. Now, let's suppose we decide we think King 2 suited does not have an expected value of 7.81 big blinds. So let's just assume you agree with my analysis here. What should we do? Or in other words, how do we fix this? There's several ways we can maybe fix these ranges, but there's no way to know for certain what's correct. Some of you watching this might think our EV is 7.81 big blinds or higher than King 2 suited, in which case there's nothing that we need to fix. But if we do think we need to make some changes here, it could be any of the following. The big blind is 3-betting hands which are too weak, perhaps. Maybe we just need to 3-bet hands that are stronger than King 2 and 6-4 suited. Those hands just might be too weak. We need to 3-bet stronger hands. Maybe the cutoff is opening too strong of a range. So maybe the cutoff is calling 3-bets with too strong of a range, and the cutoff is 4-betting too often because the cutoff was opening too strong of a range to begin with. Whereas if the cutoff opened a wider range, he'd have to fold more often to our 3-bets, so then 3-betting a hand like King 2 suited or 6-4 suited would be okay. The cutoff might just be 4-betting too aggressively. Maybe a higher fraction of his defend should be calls than 4-bets than we're currently guessing. Or the cutoff might just be calling too aggressively. Maybe he's just defending too many hands and he should fold more. All of these are reasonable adjustments that could be made. So here are my fixes. Let's flat jacks and use a mixed strategy with ace-king, perhaps only 4-bet ace-king 75% of the time. So this will decrease the cutoff's 4-betting frequency, which will allow the big blind to see a flop, effectively cheaper when it's 3-betting hands, like king 2 suited or 6-4 suited or whatever its weakest 3-bets are. So one change we can make is say, you know what, maybe the cutoff was 4-betting a little bit too much, and by calling with jacks and ace-king sometimes pre-flop, the cutoff is now 4-betting less aggressively and utilizing its positional advantage a little bit better. So that's one change I think that we should probably make. I think this makes sense as we're assuming a reasonably polarized big blind 3-betting range to begin with. And I don't think jacks work all that well as a 4-bet here, especially. I think ace-king works a little bit better, which is why it's still usually, if not always, 4-bet ace-king. And then let's fold ace-10 off to the 3-bet. I'll show you the ranges again in just a moment. We have a lot of aces, and I don't think this hand realizes its equity particularly well. That said, meh. And then just notice if the cutoff is folding ace-10 off to a 3-bet, this will likely encourage the big blind to call rather than 3-bet ace-jack off in the big blind. But again, it's hard to tell. There's no way to know for sure. But let's go look at the ranges. So this was the range we had for the cutoff defending against a 3-bet. And now, if we have the cutoff start folding all of its ace-10 offs, and maybe we have the cutoff fold some more king-jack off too, or all of its king-jack off as well, then it's also going to make, I think, the big blind 3-bets with ace-jack off less effective. So maybe we should take ace-jack off out of the big blind 3-betting range. I'm actually going to do that right now. And maybe, the big blind should just cold call with that pre-flop. It's hard to tell, though, because even if the cutoff starts folding these hands right here, and I'll go ahead and take these out of the range, and I will override it. We're not trying to get perfect here. We're just trying to really get closer or showcase the methodology that I use for trying to determine what to do pre-flop. But let's just assume we fold ace-10 off and king-jack off pre-flop from the cutoff. Then now 3-betting with ace-jack off from the big blind is going to be less effective because the cutoff's not calling with these dominated hands. So maybe these hands should get 3-bet bluffed. It's still really hard to tell. So even as I'm talking about it, I'm actually just going to go back to putting some weights here because there's no way to know for sure. And I don't want to get rid of these entirely because they're pretty good hands. So let's overwrite that again. But yeah, so we should probably adjust this range by having the cutoff fold these hands a little bit more often. And then for the 4-betting range that I just talked about, when the cutoff's in position, the cutoff maybe should call with pocket jacks against a 3-bet, and maybe sometimes call with ace-king, even though I think it can still 4-bet them at a pretty high frequency, because the big blind was 3-betting hands like ace-queen and ace-king, ace-queen and sometimes ace-jack. At least I have ace-jack suited still. So yeah, I would still mostly 4-bet ace-king from the cutoff if I think the blinds are 3-betting with like ace-queen, king-queen, and then ace-jack suited. If things start to get weird, just remember pre-flop probably uses very mixed strategies, and I already started off with ranges that I thought were quite good. So that's why we're not seeing a lot of major changes, and that's why I'm getting like, meh, because there's no way to really know, and honestly, at the end of the day, it probably does use a very mixed strategy pre-flop. An optimal player would use a very mixed strategy. All right, so moving on, we are not going to obsess over this. I have wasted too much time in the past trying to get this stuff to work perfectly pre-flop. It's impossible, it's messy, and at the end of the day, once you think your ranges are about as good as you can make them for right now, because honestly, 2 years from now, we'll probably have a stronger opinion than we do right now, but as long as right now these ranges are about as good as we can make them and they make sense, it's a waste of time to keep spending more time on this. Do not let perfect be the enemy of good. These small changes should slightly improve what are hopefully already pretty good ranges. And also note when facing a button 3-bet, we may choose to 4-bet all of our ace, king, and jack and call a bit less. I'll talk about that again in a minute. But I'd actually do exactly this as I think it's best both in practice and theory. So let's showcase that. So now always remember, all the work we do away from the tables, we need to be able to implement what we learned. So that's why I had this kind of one size fits all range for, hey, this is the cutoff calling range when we face a 3-bet. Whereas in reality, we would need to respond a little bit differently based on whether the 3-bet came from the big blind, the small blind, or the button. So right here, as I already mentioned, if the big blind 3-bets, I'm now probably going to call with jacks. But if the button 3-bet, I probably would still want to 4-bet pretty aggressively because I'd rather not play the pot out of position if I can avoid it. So because of that, maybe I'll 4-bet all of my ace kings against a button 3-bet, and I'll 4-bet all of my jacks against a button 3-bet when I'm in the cutoff. So I would change this range a little bit. And then also my opinions are always kind of changing as I make these videos and as I learn more. So, maybe I would decide now, because this is only like 2 or 3 weeks after I first made these ranges, maybe I like king jack off now a little bit more than I like 10-8 suited. So we always want to just have like a reasonable sense of what our range looks like, but we're always going to be tweaking it. And we do need to make small adjustments based on whether the 3-bet came from like the button, the small blind, or the big blind. I'm going to say it one more time because I just think it's so important for this video. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good. We are not going to get this stuff perfectly. We just need to have a sense of what our range looks like so we can adjust it as needed and have a good default game. Okay, so as for the button and big blind cold calling ranges, honestly, other than what we've done, we can't really figure out what hands exactly are plus EV calls relative to folding. Better players tend to call significantly wider than weaker players in the sense that weaker players will usually fold hands in the big blind that are like on the cusp, whereas the better players will go ahead and call with them. So note, the best players can likely make slightly plus EV calls with hands that are very difficult to play, whereas for most players, they might want to just avoid trying to call out of position with a hand like King 7 suited against a cutoff open, even if in theory it's correct. It's going to be hard to play that hand in practice. Weaker players just can't call with those hands, and there's nothing wrong with it. Don't feel bad about calling a bit tighter than some of the best players may recommend. And if you do start trying to widen up your pre-flop game, do it slowly. Don't just dive into the deep end. Slowly widen your ranges and get more comfortable with it, because that will be what allows you to get better and win more money, rather than all of a sudden using much wider ranges right off the bat. So next, we're going to check the equity of these ranges. It's good to have a sense of how much equity each range has. If something looks greatly out of place, we should fix it even if we don't know exactly how to fix it. There's no rule for exactly how much equity each range needs. Equity is only part of the picture. We also care about position and distribution of equity. So even though this isn't going to tell us if our ranges are right, it will just shed more light on what we're doing. So I've opened Equilab. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each range and compare it to another range. So here's the cutoff 3-bet calling range. And I'm going to take it right now. Place it right now. And when I do that, notice it's not going to use like fractions of combos. So it's not going to use like 8 out of 12 king jack off combos or whatever I was defending in Flopzilla. But I think that's fine. It's not that big of a deal if I'm using all 12 king jack off combos rather than only 6. So there's the cutoff flat versus 3-bet range. And then now I want to take let's take the button 3-bet range. And again, it's going to use all the ace queen combos, but it's really not a big deal. Throw in an Equilab, and it shows that the button 3-betting range has 54% equity against the cutoff calling range. That seems reasonable because the button has a better distribution of equity. The button has a more polarized range. The button has the advantage of position. And and then the button has more equity. It has 54 to 46% equity. So the button has really every advantage in its favor, but the cutoff got a really good price, right? Like the button was only 3-betting to 8.25 big blinds, and the blinds had dead money that they folded. And then I forget the exact opening size, but I think it was 2.5 big blinds for the cutoff. So the cutoff was not risking that much money to see a 3-bet pot out of position. So everything seems to make sense here. Yeah, the button's supposed to have a big advantage post-flop because the cutoff got a really good price. So yeah, it doesn't tell us that these ranges are right, but it looks reasonable here, so I'm happy with that. All right, so now let's take the small blind 3-bet and compare it to the calling range, the cutoff 3-bet calling range. This range is a little bit prettier. So this small blind 3-betting range has 53% equity. So now the small blind 3-betting range is out of position, but it has more equity than the cutoff calling range. And note that the small blind 3-betting range is only good hands. It's not even, whereas the cutoff 3-bet calling range is, where are you? Right here, right? Like it's like a condensed range is what I usually call it. It's like only middle stuff, which is like one of the harder ranges to play, and it's not a very good distribution of equity. Whereas the small blind is just like boom, really, really strong. So again, this seems reasonable to me. The cutoff has the advantage of position, and the cutoff got a good price, but the small blind just got a really freaking good range here. Everything seems like it makes sense so far. And let's lastly do the big blind range. Big blind range goes right there. And then the big blind range still has 53.3% equity, though as I mentioned earlier, we still might be 3-betting with some hands that are a little bit too weak here, because even though King 2 suited might have a good amount of equity, its equity might be very hard to realize, right? It's hard to realize the equity of King High, especially. It's sometimes even hard to realize the equity of like a pair of kings when we're out of position and there's 3 streets left to act. King 2 suited doesn't usually make very strong hands unless it's a flush. So even though King 2 suited has a good amount of equity, it might be hard to realize. But yeah, at a glance, this 53% equity seems reasonable for the reasons that I've already talked about. That said, I would probably try to strengthen this range a little bit, so maybe we'll take out this little bugger, and we'll take out King 3 and King 2 suited because they might just not be good enough, and we'll replace it with Ace 5 suited. So let's do that right now. No way to know it's right, but that seems fine. Okay, so if these ranges seem good, and if it seems like I really like them a lot as we're looking at how much equity they have, again, it's because I've already done this several times not too long ago. Whereas when I was first plugging in, new ranges I was trying into Equilab, I might find something's really wrong. So like, let's do that one more time. Let's put the big blind 3-betting range here and the cutoff versus 3-bet flat range on top of that. Look at the equity distribution. I know we changed it a little, so now we have 55% equity. And again, when we 3-bet in the big blind, we have this kind of polarized range, which has 55% equity, whereas in the small blind, we didn't even have really that many weak hands, right? We didn't, I guess we had a couple, but for the most part, the small blind's not even a polarized 3-betting range, it's just all the good stuff. All right, so, yeah, I've already looked at this stuff a lot, but when I was doing this stuff a couple months ago, maybe I would have started with a range that didn't include the suited aces and included more suited connectors. And maybe it didn't include ace-jack suited and ace-queen off or tens. And then if we put this range into Equilab, we find it only has 51.8% equity. It has less equity than the range we were just looking at. So, it doesn't tell us anything's right or wrong, but it does suggest like, oof, this range has only 52% equity. It has a lot of weak hands, and the opponent's getting a really good price in position. Maybe we need to strengthen this 3-betting range. So just overall comparing the equity of 2 ranges is a useful tool for helping you like construct an opinion of whether or not you think the range is good. All right, so I don't want to go through all of them, but another last thing we could check is we can look at like the cutoff range versus the button flat. So the cutoff open versus the button flat. And we see that the button actually has more equity here, and it has the advantage of position. So even though this is a condensed calling range, since the button has, the equity is basically the same, 50-50. But since the button has the advantage of position here, I do think the button's usually going to be in a better position on the flop. So I would expect the cutoff to check a lot. If the cutoff opens, button calls, and the blinds fold. And then, where was the big blind flat versus cutoff? All right, so it was right here. Again, we need to change maybe a few things because we changed the 3-betting range, but not that big a deal. So let's look at how much equity this range has. So this range only has 45% equity and it's out of position. But that's what we expect. That makes sense because the big blind was getting a really, really good price on its call. So since we're no longer 3-betting ace 5, king 3, king 2 suited, let's put those in the big blind flat versus cutoff and overwrite. Yeah, and it's a very aggressive calling range. It might be wrong, but since the big blind was getting such a good price against a relatively small cutoff open, this is probably about what I would defend with. And I could be wrong, but no way to know for sure. And even then, like 45% equity when we're getting such a sick price pre-flop, like our range still has a good amount of equity here. And even though we don't have any of the premium hands, when we go from pre-flop to the flop, each person goes from having access to 2 cards to 5. So we'll definitely, whatever random flop we make, we're almost always going to have some really good hands. So here, this one actually kind of misses us, but here we would still have like king jacks, we'd still have pocket 8, still have pocket 2, still have flush draws, still have jack 8 suited. You can just, oh my god, are you seriously randomly giving me these flops as I talk? This flop would be terrible. But for most randomly generated flops, the big blind is going to have a lot of like 2-pair hands and stuff. So I think this range is totally good. It's a hard range to play out of position, but it does have a considerable amount of equity, and it was getting a very good price. I should actually make myself really clear here. It is going to matter quite a bit whether or not the big blind can have offsuit 2-pair combos on the flop, and that's just something you have to get comfortable with. There's going to be some boards where there's a king and a 9, or a queen and a 9, or a jack and a 9, or a king and a 10, and the big blind can have the offsuit 2 pairs. And there's going to be other boards where the big blind can only have the suited 2 pairs. So even though the big blind is not going to have a lot of 2-pair hands it's usually going to make a couple combinations of sets, a couple 2 pairs. It'll have some good draws. The range isn't great, but I think it will do okay given how good of a price it was getting. So that's why I would call with some pretty weak hands like queen 6 suited. Also, since I was thinking and talking, I actually don't think the jack 8-3 flop misses us that badly, even though we can't have the offsuit 2 pairs. So one thing you can do is you can just throw it into Equilab and see how it does, see how the equity changes. So the big blind went from having 45% equity to 46.7. So not a huge change in equity there. This flop's really not that bad for our range, whereas something like 5-5-3, of course, would be terrible. Because even if we had a lot of equity on the 5-5-3 board, we would have pretty much no good hands. And I'm guessing we don't even have that much equity. Yeah, we don't. So when you are learning how to play this big blind calling range, and work your way into it. Don't just jump in. But if you are starting to call wider out of the big blind, you can just take flops, throw them into Equilab, see how equities change, and that will help you sort of decide what to do. So I do apologize for all the little mini tangents that I went on the last few minutes. I didn't mean to do that, but it just sometimes happens when I'm trying to think and talk. All right, so let's jump back into the organized slides and get back on track. So one of the things I was looking forward to doing in this video was figuring out how often with these ranges we're going to be playing 3-bet pots relative to raise pots. So it's important to know what aspects of our game we should spend the most time trying to improve. Everyone gets better studying and analyzing their play, but we want to be as efficient as possible. So let's see how often the cutoff will play a 3-bet pot relative to a raise pot. So let's just do some math. So how often is the cutoff open called? The cutoff is called just 24% of the time. We did that math in the first video. But the cutoff is 3-bet 31.6% of the time. And once we get 3-bet, if we're in the cutoff, we'll call about 42% of the time. Again, we might have changed these percentages slightly in the last few minutes, but it's nothing significant, and we're not letting perfect be the enemy of good. So if we're defending 42% of the time in the cutoff after we get 3-bet, and if we're 3-bet 31.6% of the time, we take 0.316, multiply it by 0.42, and we get 13.3%. So if we're going to be playing in a 3-bet pot about 13.3% of the time after opening in the cutoff, and if we're going to be playing in a raised pot, a single raised pot, 24% of the time after opening in the cutoff, then if we convert these into a ratio, we'll play a single raised pot about 1.8 times for every time we play a 3-bet pot. Also keep in mind the vast majority of the single raise pots we're playing will be when we open at the cutoff, the button folds, the small blind folds, and then the big blind calls. So the pot will be quite small there. I know we'll rarely also be 4-bet cold and stuff like that. Sometimes we'll also get into like multi-way pots, but that's not the super detailed stuff I'm really worried about in this video. So now to me, when I see this, I realize, whoa, from what I think is optimal now, we're going to be playing 3-bet pots all of the time, like nonstop. Whereas I remember poker just like 7 or 8 years ago, and I really didn't understand poker well at all 7 years ago when I was playing, but I just didn't think 3-bet pots really occurred that often. 3-bet pots were almost like something special. Like, oh, it's a 3-bet pot, let me pay attention. That's not a very common occurrence. Whereas now it's like 3-bet pots should be happening just absolutely all of the time. We're playing the 3-bet pot We don't even play 2 single raise pots for every time we play a 3-bet pot, and most of the single raise pots are just when the big blind calls after we open in the cutoff. So it really is kind of just shining light on what we should be focusing on in our game, because we want to focus on the stuff that's going to occur more often. Whereas I know in a lot of my older videos, I would deal with spots where it's like cutoff opens and just the button calls, where in reality, I don't think that's going to be occurring all that often compared to this stuff. So it appears I got a little excited because I just said that stuff in the next slide. So compare this to back in the day when playing 3-bet pots was much less common than single raise pots. And we're playing 3-bet pots all the time now. And 3-bet pots are just a lot bigger than single raise pots. 3-bet pots are usually 18 or 19 big blinds, while single raise pots are only 5.5 or 6.5 big blinds. Remember, if we open at 2.5 big blinds in the cutoff and the button in the small blind fold and the big blind calls, the pot's only 5.5 big blinds. That's a really small pot, so it's probably not going to be something, I mean, it's something we should definitely work on because it's going to occur so often, but 3-bet pots occur really often, and they're for a lot of money. So what does this mean? Did I just spoil it in the next slide already too? Ugh. All right, so it just means if I were actively trying to get better, the majority of my emphasis would be placed on playing 3-bet pots. They happen a lot, and they're worth a lot of money. Playing well in 3-bet pots is arguably more important than playing well in single raise pots. Again, many moons ago, 3-bet pots were considered more of an afterthought. Now they likely deserve more attention than any other aspect of your game. So, for the people that I usually talk poker with now, I would say probably 75% of the hands we discuss are 3-bet pots. Whereas it used to be the complete opposite. But I really do think that now, especially if we're like writing out our entire ranges and trying to figure out what we do in certain spots and how we can, hopefully play closer to optimal. Literally, I would say it's probably 65 to 75% of the work we do is in 3-bet pots. It might even be more than that. It's just 3-bet pots seem like they're the name of the game now. And especially once players are getting like sort of to no limit 200 or maybe higher, that's really what they want to work on. But I would recommend working on that even if you're playing lower, because if I had to guess, I would rather be better at playing 3-bet pots than single raise pots, as crazy as it sounds. And for that matter, if I wanted to get good at playing single raise pots, I'd really learn how to defend a wide range from the big blind against button and cutoff opens, and I'd learn how to play as the cutoff or the button against a wide range when I opened in the cutoff or the button and the big blind called. Again, that's not the stuff that I really discussed a lot in older videos because I didn't think that or know that at the time. But in reality, I think that's where you're actually going to be, playing the most often. So that's what I would worry about if I wanted to get better. On that note, let's spend 30 minutes on cutoff versus button play in single raise pots. While I know pre-flop play is usually considered pretty easy, so far this series has been pretty math intensive, and pre-flop play can get pretty complicated. Additionally, you may have decided to change your ranges quite a bit, which will take time to implement. So I imagine a lot of people that are watching this video are saving the screen and then saving the ranges to look at and think about later. So you've probably already seen a lot of stuff in this video and in the last video that's new to you that's going to take time to implement if you do decide to incorporate it into your game. So let's work on something a bit less dense right now and go over some cutoff versus button spots for single raise pots from the cutoff's perspective. So I feel like we got the really important kind of harder stuff out of the way. The last 25 minutes of this video is still going to be useful, but I don't think it's going to be as difficult to watch or think about. A few things to note. I only plan on spending 30 minutes on this for the whole series, since we'll mostly be focusing on 3-bet pots. I know I've addressed single raise cutoff versus button play before, but I feel like I've learned a lot since I last addressed it, so I think we should spend a little bit of time on it, even though we're mostly going to focus on 3-bet pots. Also note, a game theoretically optimal player would likely use a lot of mixed strategies here. So the cutoff should probably be doing a lot of mixed strategies, bet sometimes, check sometimes with the same hand, so just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind our c-bet range from the cutoff will likely be quite low here as we're out of position with a range not much stronger than the opponent's. So by our c-bet range, I mean our c-betting frequency will be quite low here because we're out of position and our range just really isn't that much better, if better, than the buttons. And guess along with me, you'll gain much more this way. So even though this is going to be easier than the last hour and a half of this series, you'll gain a lot more if you are sort of actively watching and challenging your thoughts as you see the video. So when I do this, I start with putting the cutoff opening range on top, then the button calling range below it. We'll go ahead and just give the button all the ace queen here, no big deal. And then we'll see, as we saw earlier, it's about 50% equity for each range. So we want to sort of guess how that equity is going to change before we type in the flop texture to see how close we are with our original estimation. All right, so let's go first. Let's randomly generate a board. All right, so 842. So now you're going to want to pause and think for a moment, how much equity do you think each range has on this 842 board before I hit this evaluate button right here and we actually get the answer. So pause for a moment and think how the equity of the range changes. All right, and I'm going to guess this board I think definitely favors the cutoff opening range, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to guess the cutoff opening range goes up to like 52% equity. All right, so only to 50.6. That said, I still think it really favors the cutoff opening range because the button's only real strong hand on this flop is pocket eights. Like if we look at the button's equity, or sorry, not equity, if we look at the button's distribution of hands, we'll see that the button has pocket nines or its only overpairs, and then its only sets are pocket eights. So the button has very, very few strong hands here. So even though the button didn't lose that much equity, I thought the button was going to lose a little more equity on this flop than it did. The button's range is still going to be very weak here because the button has a pretty capped range. It has 3 combos of pocket eights and that's it. And it doesn't really have any good pairs other than that. Like even a hand like pocket nines, it's a pretty strong hand here. Like if we look, the cutoff's only going to have pocket nines beat around 13.5% of the time. But the problem is a lot of the hands in the cutoff range just have a ton of equity even against pocket nines. So because of that, it's very, very hard to even play pocket nines effectively when you're in the button shoes, despite the fact that nines are not very often beat on the flop. And another thing you can do, which I do like to do sometimes, is like, let's check out to see how much equity pocket nines have against a c-bet. Because let's say the cutoff c-bets his entire range here, how much equity would pocket nines have? And again, I'm going to guess here, even though like I have no idea here. So I'm just totally going to guess because I think I'll remember better if I'm wrong. I'm not trying to guess here because I'm like show off like, hey, I know this spot because I don't. But I'm going to guess nines have like, I'm going to guess nines have like 69, 70% equity. Oh, so sick. Yeah, totally just guessed and got lucky. But so even nines, like they're going to get out. They're going to be losing by the river. I know that's a bad way to describe it. If we were to get all in on the flop with nines against this range, nines would still lose a third of the time on the river. Like nines are very susceptible to being outdrawn here. Okay, so let's go back to putting in the entire cutoff flatting range. Okay, so how would I actually play this board in practice if I were playing against an opponent? And I want to give very quick answers here. I don't want to like write out my entire range because I want to be more realistic for how I'd actually play this range if I had to make a decision very quickly. Honestly, I'd probably c-bet the entire cutoff opening range here because I think the button just doesn't have that many strong hands. Yeah, the cutoff doesn't have that much more equity than the button, but the fact that the cutoff has all the like really premium hands is just so incredibly useful here, and there aren't really any hands that I think make great check calls. So in reality, I would probably c-bet against an unknown with my entire range on the flop here if I was in the cutoff. But if I was actually able to like use a HUD or I had a read on my opponent, I would really consider check calling with almost any medium strength hand. So like a hand like pocket sevens, pocket sixes, pocket fives, anything like that, some 8x hands. If you have reads on your opponents, consider check calling. Especially with a hand like ace king or ace queen, those hands can make really good check calls on the flop as well. But almost all these hands make fine bets. Like let's take ace king. Ace king is a hand where I probably 2 years ago would have really liked check calling it on the flop, and if I had to guess, it probably is a mixed strategy in theory. But ace king also makes a pretty good bet on the flop because if we bet ace king and we turn an ace or a king, we're going to have a really strong hand. We can bet ace king on the flop. Our opponent's still going to float us on the flop with probably ace queen and ace jack. So if we turn an ace and we have ace king, he has ace jack or ace queen. That's awesome. So betting ace king can make a lot of sense here. And the other thing you want to be aware of, and I think this is the one thing I would really take from this hand if if you don't take anything else, is like, say you bet ace king on this flop. Someone watching you play might say like, well, wait a second, why are you betting ace king? Is it a value bet or a bluff? And the reason why betting ace king is okay, I do think depends on the overall range of both players, but you don't need to consider ace king a value bet or a bluff on this flop if you bet it. So I can bet ace king on this flop. I'm betting it because if I'm behind, I might draw out. I'm betting it kind of for value if my opponent has ace queen or ace jack or he floats. And I need to understand that if I bet ace king on this flop, I'm probably going to check it on any like non-ace or king turn, because then I can still win at showdown if my opponent checks back, ace queen or ace jack. So like, let's say, for example, the turn was a 4. I could check ace king and still beat my opponent's ace queen or something. But the other thing too is like, if I bet ace king on this flop here, I don't know what I'm going to do on the turn. I might check call, I might check fold. So if the turn card's a jack, I'm just going to check fold. Whereas if the turn card is like a 3, I'm probably going to check call. Because I still think ace king can easily, like, let's say the turn was the 3 diamonds. Our opponent can be betting some sort of overcards that we beat. He might be betting some, let me think if he has gut shots. He could be betting maybe some gut shots if he can have like 7-6 suited. He can have some flush draws. So ace king can definitely be the best hand if we check call it on the turn. Ace king has showdown value. And then even if we are behind, if our opponent has a hand like, 8-9, if our opponent has those pocket nines I talk so much about, we have 10 outs. So ace king, I think, is a really cool hand in this spot because when you bet it, you don't know whether you're going to like check call it or check fold it on a non-ace, non-king turn. It's really going to depend on the turn card. So yeah, going to check fold it probably on a queen, going to check call it probably on a 3, whereas things can get a little bit trickier as we make it like a 7 or a 9. So don't be afraid to bet ace king here. Check calling is fine too when you got to read, but yeah, I'd probably just bet my entire range on the cutoff here because there's not really any like ideal check calling hands. There's some hands that are pretty good, but not like any awesome check calling hands. And, we're just not going to get raised on this flop very much. The opponent doesn't really have that many good hands in the button, so we can barrel aggressively despite our range not having a whole ton of equity. Let's randomly generate the turn because, again, too often in videos in the past, I only talked about the flop. All right, so the turn's a 7. Oh, that was like the super hard turn. Okay, so on this turn, I'm going to try to think about the hands that would be maybe interesting. So start off checking with hands that can win at showdown if your opponent checks down, a weaker hand by maybe making a mistake. So I'm probably going to check, let me think of a good example. I'm probably going to check like the most obvious hands I would check down with, or I would check with on the turn, I think would be like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, because I think these hands are going to win at showdown sometimes when the opponent makes a mistake, or like he just checks down with like ace 10 himself, which might not even be that. Yeah, that'd probably be a mistake here. So I would probably start checking with these hands. I don't think I would want to double barrel these too much, because if we look at the cutoff opening range, I think we'll just have enough flush draws. 7 point, yeah, we'll have a good amount of flush draws, and we'll have like some straight draws and some, random sixes, like ace 6 we can bet. Ace 5 is double gutted, right? Like ace 5's tricky, but yeah, ace 5 of spades is double gutted. It has the 3 or the 6. So I don't think we're going to need to bluff too much with overcards, but if we want to get technical, it really is probably a mixed strategy. So if I had to guess, we maybe would bet these ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 some of the time, whereas in reality, I think I'd mostly check them. I think I'd probably mostly check ace king too for the same reason. But, we could use a hand like ace jack or something as a bluff, but I probably would check these hands and try to win at showdown. All right, what else is close? If I have like a random pair of 8s or 7s here, I'm almost certainly going to check a call. I keep saying It depends on the pair of 8s. So let's look at the cutoff opening again. Like I'm probably going to value bet twice with like the good 8s, the king 8, the queen 8, the jack 8s, the stuff like this. I'll probably value bet those twice. But the weaker 8s, I would probably check call, and I would almost certainly check call the 7s on the turn. What was the button flat? Yeah, and especially if the button had 10s, which I think a lot of button ranges will actually have 10s in practice. So yeah, I would probably be check calling with 7s, and a lot of playing well is just doing the obvious stuff with the obvious hands. So it's pretty obvious to check call on the turn with 7s here. And then 8s, I think you can mostly bet them, especially the ones with good kickers. But you could also check call some of the weaker 8s too. I'm trying to think if anything else is really that interesting that I should point out. Yeah, I'm not going to double barrel the overcards all that often here because there is so much draw. So I would rather just bluff with hands that have more robust equity. So whenever you're watching a video like this, and I know most of you know this, but you don't want to think I said don't double barrel with ace queen. I'm just saying in this spot, it seems like we can check ace queen on the turn, maybe win at showdown, especially if the opponent makes a mistake. And I don't probably need to bluff with it because I have so many other good bluff randomizers like ace-7, king-7, ace-6, king-6, stuff like that. That's gut shot stuff. So I think I would probably check those hands. All right. So hopefully everything's pretty clear. You know, obviously double barrel stuff like, I think Jack 10 I double barrel, Jack 9 I double barrel, 10 9 I double barrel. So yeah, I can see a lot of value hands here that I'm going to double barrel. And another thing we can do too is on this flop, since we see bet at such a high frequency, it's totally cool to like check raise our good turned hands. So if you want to check raise pocket 7s, pocket 4s, pocket 2s, totally fine to check raise them now. Definitely a good play. The same way people don't check raise nearly enough on the flop as the pre-flop raiser, people might not check raise this turn enough. So, you know, it's totally fine to go for the check raise with pocket 4s here, but ideally you'd have stats on your opponent. And if you did try to check raise on the turn with 4s and it checks back, you can make a large river bet if you want. So let's go ahead and randomly generate that river actually while we talk about that. Oh, a 2. Fantastic. So my general rule is if your opponents aren't going to raise, consider overbetting. So let's imagine we checked on the turn, our opponent checked back, then the river card came this 2. If we lead by betting here, do you really think the button's ever going to raise? I mean, the only hands that would really make sense for the button to raise would be, we can look at the button flattening range, they'd be full houses, right? The button can't have any random 2. So they'd pretty much be full houses or probably straights, but we don't expect any of those hands to check back on the turn. So if we do get a river card that didn't really improve any hands in the button's cold calling, sorry, I don't want to say cold calling. If we did get a river card that didn't improve any hands in the button's turn checking range, then we should consider overbetting on the river. And this gets complicated. Again, there's mixed strategies and all that fun stuff. But at least, especially if you have reads, consider overbetting on this river if you have a really strong hand like pocket 4s, because you don't really have a removal effect that's, you know, you're not really blocking anything important. And you're not really going to get raised if you bet half pot on the river, right? That's all the value you're really going to get. So you can consider overbetting. And it's just a play that I like to do, I think. I like to recommend it, at least I should say. I shouldn't say do it, because I haven't had many opportunities to do it. But yeah, consider overbetting here if you do check a strong hand on the turn and it checks back and you get a river like this. Whereas if the river was something like, let me think, what would be a good example for a river card? If the river was something like a 5, I might be a little bit less likely to overbet this, because then I think the button can have hands like pocket 6s, 7-6, which now make this straight. So I think overbetting will be less effective here. And also, if we did have a 6 in our hand, our opponent might have expected us to double barrel. So on the 6th river, I think I'd be less likely to overbet. I'd probably bet smaller because my opponent can have some good hands on the river, so he can have a river raising range where he'll raise, of course, his straights and hopefully some bluff raises. All right, so I know we didn't talk about every single possible hand, but hopefully that was beneficial, and we'll randomly generate another one. So, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, stop! All right. So this is one of the easiest boards to play for both the cutoff and the button. A lot of times you're going to be faced with really hard decisions in poker. This really isn't a board where that's going to happen much. Most of the lines I think are pretty easy to take here. But that said, let's play Guess That Equity. So I already did this once and had to delete the recording, but I guessed both ranges are still going to have around 50% equity each. Keep in mind we had the button call with all the ace queen, but it's not going to make that big a deal. And then I also think the fact that there's 2 5s give the cutoff. I mean, the queen's going to kind of help the button, I think, because the button has all the ace queen and queen kings. But the 2 5s I think are actually going to help the cutoff opening range rather than the button, because yeah, the button only has 6-5 suited, whereas the cutoff has quite a bit more 5s. So that's why, I guess it would be 50% equity. So you can pause and guess for a minute. But the answer is, it's about 48.52. So still pretty close. And yeah, the button does have a little bit more equity here than it did pre-flop. Now, both in position and out of position ranges are really easy to play here. And you really should just be doing taking the obvious line with the obvious hands. So what do I mean by that? You could check raise on this board sometimes, because remember, the button only has like 6-5. Like, the button has like no nutted hands. It has 2.5% nutted hands. So it's probably fine to check raise on this flop sometimes as the cutoff. You could also check call on the flop and wait to check raise on the turn or on the river. But it's even fine to just check raise on the flop. That's a good line to take if the button was planning on betting hands like, 8s or 7s or 9s for only like one street of value. Or if you just want to be sure you get value from your opponents, like queen jack before a king or an ace comes. So it is fine to check raise on the flop as the cutoff, but I wouldn't do it very often. And I would mostly just say if I'm the cutoff, I'm probably going to bet the vast majority of my hands that are over pair or better, and then I'm going to probably be value betting like, I'm going to probably try to bet all 3 streets with ace queen or better, but I don't think king queen or better can get value betting all 3 streets, though I could be wrong, and it probably will depend a little bit on the run out, but I probably would not look to go bet all 3 streets with king queen against a good player. I don't think we'll really get value. I don't think I'll have to call down with enough queen jack, and the button didn't flat queen jack off. So yeah, all right. So yeah, this is a pretty easy board to play. So let's randomly generate a turn. So before talking about this turn, there's one kind of tricky thing I left out on this flop. So let's say we're in the cutoff and we're not c-betting on this flop 100% of the time, and I definitely don't think we should be. I do like a lot check folding on the flop with something like, let's just say like king 5 of clubs. King 5 of clubs is awful. So if I'm going to check fold some hands on the flop here, I think check folding, oh my gosh, king 5 of clubs is trips. Sorry, king 6 of clubs. Whew. Some people are probably nerd raging. King 6 of clubs is awful here. I apologize to the trips. So with a hand like king 6 of clubs, I would rather have some hands in my flop checking range as the cutoff that can just very cleanly check fold. Like I don't mind check folding them. Once I've checked if my opponent bets, he can have the pot. And I need to be check folding some of the time here. What I don't want to do out of position is just only check like the kind of easy, obvious hands. So I don't want to only check on the flop with like queen jack to queen 8, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, maybe some like ace king, and only check call those hands because I'm like, oh, well, these are kind of medium strength hands that aren't super afraid of giving free cards. I think that's something that's not like a terrible strategy, but it's pretty exploitable and it's kind of obvious what you're doing there to someone that's really paying attention. So it's good to have some hands on the flop that can just check fold. Whereas a lot of times in reality, I think if the cutoff checked on this board, he wouldn't check fold because any hand that, you know, is really, really weak, he would have just c-bet bluffed with it. But if you check with a hand on the flop as the cutoff that's like king 6 of clubs, you can check fold it if you face a bet, so that keeps you kind of balanced on the flop. You have some folding range, and then you can also use it as a bluff randomizer later, because if the flop goes check, check, and the turn card comes something like a 3, you're going to need some hands that can bluff, whereas if you were only checking on the flop with those like weak queen X, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, maybe some of the ace, king, ace, jack stuff, you don't really have anything that can bluff on the 4 turn. So just keep that in mind. I do like check folding some really, really weak hands on the flop here rather than c-betting them, even if c-betting them is profitable. It can still be profitable to check the weak stuff and bluff it later. And if your opponent's really thinking, I think it actually looks very value-y when you check on this flop, he checks back, and then you bet the turn. It looks like you just have pocket jacks. Okay, cool. So I know we had a 6 of hearts on the turn, which we'll keep talking about. Now, on this 6 of hearts turn, you should mostly be doing the obvious thing. So if you have like a hand that's ace queen or better, of course you should mostly bet. If you have a hand that's like, let's say we turned the 6 with king 6, we should probably check that. And that hand we should probably check call with. So you want to, do the obvious things. Bet with the strong hands for value. Check call with like your medium strength hands here, whichever ones you have, and then bluff with like the hands that have robust equity, like any sort of 7/8s or flush draws. You want to mostly bet with those. You can still do the tricky line once in a while. Like there's probably nothing really wrong with, once in a while check raising an overpair or something like that. It probably can get like to have a mixed strategy with some hands in theory, but just mostly make sure you're doing the obvious stuff. But the thing that I wanted to talk about specifically is I wanted to talk about some like marginal strength hands that you could have bet with on the flop, so you do have them in your range to check call the turn. So, for example, I think on the flop, I would have bet with a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 8s and planned to check call it on the turn, because by betting with pocket 8s or pocket 7s, I'll just click them right now. Like if I bet pocket 7s on the flop, I can make my opponent fold a lot of high equity hands. Like if my opponent folds his, ace 8, ace 9, jack 10, ace 10, jack 9, king, jack, hand, anything like that. If he folds 2 over cards, he folded a reasonably high equity hand. And then it also is a hand that can check call on some turns like a low turn card. But even pocket 7s on this flop, I don't really have a very strong opinion if you bet it on the flop or if you check call it, because they both seem reasonable. Maybe it's a mixed strategy. Maybe one line is better. I don't know which one. They both seem reasonable. Likewise, a hand like Queen 9 of diamonds. I could see an argument for both betting that on the flop and check calling it. On one hand, we might want to check call it because Queen 9s isn't that strong and we can't bet all three streets for value. But by the same token, maybe we should bet it on the flop and check call it on the turn because, we need some hands that can bet the flop and then check call the turn. So it gets very tricky. So there's a lot of hands in here that can go in like either range and you can't really do anything that wrong. Like, you can't really make that big a mistake, I don't think, by betting or checking Queen 9 on the flop. So just be aware of that. As I said, I think this board's relatively easy to play. It's kind of hard to make a big mistake, which is why I pointed out the kind of tricky thing you can do with like King 6 of clubs. But for the most part, hands that seem close can probably take either line, and in theory, it may very well be a mixed strat. And lastly, it would also get very tricky with a hand like King 7 of clubs. So if you checked a really, really weak hand on the flop like King 7 of clubs, you might be saying like, well, wait a second, do I bet on the turn? Because then I can threaten to bet on the river too, so that might make my opponent fold a little bit more, and I can take this, bluff opportunity now on the turn, whereas if I check, my opponent might bet, and then I never get a bluff opportunity. Or should I check it again to bluff it on the river? Because I might also need some hands that can go like check flop, check turn, value bet river, so I need some hands that can go check flop, check turn, bluff bet river. It's very tricky, right? Like, I don't like betting King 7 on the flop, King 7 of clubs on the flop for the reasons I already explained, but whether or not you should start bluffing it on the turn or wait to bluff it on the river, I don't really know. And again, it's probably likely, it might not be a mixed strategy specifically with King 7 of clubs, but there probably are some really weak hands that need to check the flop and then bet the turn, and there might be some really weak hands that need to check flop and turn and then bet the river, depending on what you're overall doing with your range. So yeah, I'm just trying to point out a hopefully kind of cool concept here, but for the most part, I think this board's pretty easy to play when you're both in and out of position. We can just randomly generate the river for a completion, but I don't think I'll even have anything that interesting to talk about. Yeah, I just don't. Obviously check your jacks on the river if you rivered them. Meh. Nothing really interesting here. All right, so let's generate one last one. Right. Yeah. Okay, so ace 4-2 rainbow. This one I actually really don't know how equities change on. I'm still going to guess, of course, but I have very little idea here. All right, so why don't you make your own guess too before I randomly generate it? I'm going to think for just a moment. I'm going to guess the cutoff gains a little bit of equity here and goes up to like 51% because the cutoff's opening quite a lot of aces, and then the 4 and the 2 really, I guess the 4 and the 2 hit the cutoff opening range a little bit more because the cutoff makes the sets. I'm analyzing too much. Yeah, I'm going to guess 51% equity. All right, cool. I'm running really good with this. So this is a more dynamic board where there's just a lot more draws in both players' range. And, the obvious draw is the flush draw. There's not too many straight draws yet, though there might be straight draws on the turn. So on this flop, when we're out of position as the cutoff, I don't think we should have like a super high c-bet frequency. It probably shouldn't be that low, but we shouldn't have like a super high c-bet frequency. And we should be check calling with some pretty good hands. We should be check raising on the flop. So on this flop, I would probably look to check raise at least some, if not all of the sets. I wouldn't really slow play any strong hands on this flop other than like pocket aces, because I don't really like check calling any like nut type hands until your opponents are overbetting after you check call. So like, in order to check call a hand like pocket twos, I would want to sometimes face an overbet if we check called and the turn card came as 7 of spades. And I just don't think that really happens. I very rarely have seen people show me hands where they face opponents that do that. So yeah, I wouldn't slow play anything here other than maybe pocket aces because we have a removal effect. So yeah, let's check call pocket aces, check raise the 4s and the 2s. I think it's okay to check raise bluff like the 5-4 and 6-4, and that might be something I would miss if I was playing. So even 5-4, I know 5-4 people are saying like, well, wait a second, you could c-bet it or you could check call it and it's profitable. Yeah, but check raising bloats the pot, and if we check raise right now, like look at the button flatting range. Like what's this guy going to 3-bet with? He doesn't have anything that's stronger than top pair. So if we check raise 5-4 suited, we're pretty much guaranteed to realize it's equity. We're at least going to get to see the turn without getting 3-bet. And honestly, I don't think we're going to get raised on the turn either. So yeah, I really just convinced myself to check raise high equity hands as like semi bluffs here. So yeah, I think that favors check raising a hand like 5-4 suited, because if we check on the flop and it checks through, we might still have a good hand. We still do have a hand with showdown value. It's still going to be like a pretty tricky hand on like a 3 or a 4 turn. And then if we do get the check raise in on the flop, we're probably going to get it realized as equity and it's a high equity hand. So yeah, I think check raising something like 6-4 and 5-4 here can be pretty good. Ace-2 is 2 pairs, so we can't check raise that. Yeah, and then, mostly do the obvious stuff. Mostly bet the flop with your ace-queen, ace-king, like the ace-jack and the ace-10, those are hands, again, that we're just not going to bet all 3 streets. So if we had, like, ace-10 off with the 10 of diamonds and the ace of hearts, you just know you can't bet all 3 streets, so it's probably fine to check the flop and call. It's probably fine to bet the flop and check the turn. There's multiple things that you can do with ace-10 that are probably totally fine. It's probably just somewhat of a mixed strategy here. Yeah, so I don't think there's anything too difficult. Just make sure you're c-betting as like a bluff with your like robust equity hands. So like I think checking something like 6-5 of spades would be really bad, for example. But yeah, I don't think this board's too bad to play. And then the hands I would check call for sure would probably be like kings, queens, jacks. I'd be a little more likely to I would bet 10s, 9s, or 8s and probably check call them on some turn cards, because 10s, 9s, and 8s, like let's look to see how often 10s are beat. Oh, that's the wrong range. 10s beat our opponent's 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, and 5s, some of which are going to have to call, if not all of them. Probably just some, though. And then, so we'll get value if we bet 10s from these hands, whereas if we check, they'll check back. And 10s are also vulnerable on the turn, whereas if we bet on the flop, we might make our opponent fold some, like, king, jack, queen, jack, king, queen stuff. Use judgment on that, because if your opponent won't fold king, queen, then betting 10s on the flop probably becomes less appealing. But yeah, I think I would bet 9s on the flop as a cutoff here. That might be a leak, but my argument for it would be is I can get value from lower underpairs, and I can make my opponent fold some hands like king 10, queen jack, queen 10, jack 10 stuff. Again, that might be wrong. Maybe I should check call on the flop, but I think I would just check call kings, queens, jacks, and maybe 10s. Then I would bet like 9s and maybe 10s. And then I don't know what I do with 8s. Also, be sure to note that if we are check raising our sets on the flop, we might not have that many hands that can check raise the turn unless we improved with some hands. So let's randomly generate that turn right now. All right, so like this is one where we clearly improved with our flush draws and how flushes. So we could definitely have a check raising range here on this turn. So if we wanted to check raise some flushes, that'd probably be fine. Whereas if the turn was something like let's think here. I'm trying to just think of a turn card that would give us like no nutted hands. If the turn card was something like a 9, we might not like have really improved any hands, so it'd be very hard to check raise on this turn, especially if we didn't check our pocket 9s. All right, so what was my turn? It was 7 clubs. Okay, so on this board, it's going to be harder to keep getting value. So like we might have on the flop planned on going bet, bet, bet with ace queen, or maybe even ace jack to get 3 streets of value. We definitely can't do that now, at least with ace jack. Even ace queen, my guess is, would be too thin. So even if the turn card didn't affect our specific hand, right? Like ace queen still top pair, basically top kicker. It's it's going to be harder to get value since now there's flushes in our range and in our opponents. That's super obvious, but just still keep it in mind. So even if I say on the flop like, oh, we're going to try to bet ace queen through all 3 streets, really easy to just get a turn or river that doesn't let us. So on the turn, I probably ace queen can get kind of weird. I think if I had ace queen with a queen of clubs, I would definitely check call it. Yeah, that I would do for sure. But if I had ace queen off with no club, I think you can argue, like let's bet flop, bet turn, and then check call river. Or we could just start checking on the turn. I think both of those are probably fine. Yeah, it may very well be a mixed strat, but I think I would probably keep betting ace king on the turn and start checking ace queen and ace jack if I did bet ace jack on the flop. Okay, and then I would see bet most of my flush draws. You can maybe get tricky and check call some of the nut flushes. You can maybe get tricky and check raise some of the flushes as well. But also just keep in mind that I don't really like check calling hands to slow play until your opponents are overbetting. So I probably would be less likely in practice to check call a really strong hand here. All right, and let's randomly generate the river. So the river didn't do anything. So whichever range bet on the turn is probably going to stay, or be reasonably polarized on the river. And then whichever hand called on the turn is probably going to be reasonably condensed, meaning it doesn't have too many nutted hands or too many really weak hands. It's possible the person that called on the turn has like the nut flush, but other than like the nut flush, it's pretty hard to slow play a monster on the turn. So yeah, since the river didn't really do anything, I expect whoever bet on the turn to have a pretty big advantage on the river because he'll just have more of the strong hands. And then, whoever bet on the turn is probably going to bet on the river at a reasonably high frequency because of that. But nothing too special going on here. So yeah, I think that hopefully wraps it up. This cutoff versus button stuff definitely isn't new. I've talked about it in other videos. Hopefully the analysis gets better over time, but it's still more of the same. And then just know we're going to do similar to what I just did now for 3-bet pots, and hopefully it should be reasonably fun and easy to watch and not too math intensive. But yeah, it's going to be probably pretty similar to this. And I'll definitely show you math for it in the slides, but I want to spend a lot of time actually analyzing the board texture and talking about what we can do on different turns and rivers based on how we designed our range on the previous street. So thanks for watching the video. I hope everyone enjoyed this. Feel free to leave any questions or comments in the forums. Thanks. Bye.